The winter of 1847 struck the Montana Territory with a vengeance that old-timers would remember for decades. Snow fell in sheets so thick that even the most experienced mountain men questioned their ability to survive another day. Among these hardy souls was Jake Morrison, a trapper whose weathered hands had skinned more beaver pelts than he could count, and whose piercing blue eyes had seen things that would make lesser men abandon the frontier forever. On this particular morning, as Morrison checked his trap lines along the Yellowstone River, he discovered something that would change not only his life, but the delicate balance of power between the white settlers and the Comanche Nation. The child couldn't have been more than 8 years old, his small frame nearly buried beneath a drift of snow that had accumulated during the night. Morrison's heart raced as he knelt beside the motionless figure, brushing away the crystalline powder to reveal the distinctive features and traditional clothing of a Comanche boy. The child's lips were blue with cold, his breathing shallow and irregular, but he was alive. Morrison had spent enough time on the frontier to understand the gravity of this discovery. Finding a Comanche child alone, hundreds of miles from their usual territory, could mean only one thing. Something terrible had happened to separate this boy from his people. Without hesitation, Morrison scooped the child into his arms and carried him back to his small cabin, nestled in a grove of pines about 2 miles from the river. The trapper's rough exterior masked a heart that had always held a soft spot for children, having lost his own son to smallpox 3 winters prior. As he worked to warm the boy by his stone fireplace, Morrison couldn't help but notice the intricate beadwork on the child's moccasins and the quality of his winter clothing. This was no ordinary Comanche child, the craftsmanship suggested. He came from a family of considerable importance within the tribe. The boy's eyes fluttered open as warmth began to return to his small body. They were dark as midnight and filled with the intelligence that seemed far beyond his years. When Morrison offered him water, the child drank gratefully but remained silent, watching the grizzled trapper with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Morrison had picked up enough Comanche words during his years of trading to attempt basic communication, but the boy seemed to understand English well enough, nodding when asked if he was hurt and shaking his head when offered food. As the hours passed, Morrison began to piece together fragments of the child's story. Through a combination of broken English, hand gestures, and simple drawings in the dirt beside the fireplace, the boy revealed that his name was Small Wolf, and that he had become separated from his band during a blizzard 3 days earlier. What troubled Morrison was the child's reluctance to explain how he had ended up so far north of traditional Comanche territory. The boy's eyes would darken whenever Morrison pressed for details about his family or the circumstances of his separation from the tribe. The first hook came at midday when Morrison stepped outside to gather more firewood. In the distance, barely visible through the swirling snow, he caught sight of movement along the ridgeline that bordered his small valley. At first, he assumed it was elk or perhaps a small herd of buffalo, but as he squinted against the glare of the winter sun, the shapes resolved into something far more ominous. Riders, multiple riders, moving with the practiced stealth that Morrison recognized from his encounters with various Indian tribes over the years. Morrison's blood ran cold as he counted the figures silhouetted against the sky. There had to be at least 20 warriors, possibly more, and they were moving in a deliberate pattern that suggested they were tracking something. The trapper's mind raced as he realized the implications. These had to be Comanche warriors searching for the boy he had rescued, and judging by their numbers and the purposeful way they moved, Small Wolf was far more important than Morrison had initially realized. Returning to the cabin with his arms full of firewood, Morrison tried to maintain a calm demeanor, but the boy immediately sensed something was wrong. Small Wolf moved to the single window and peered out through a gap in the shutters, his body tensing as he spotted the distant riders. The child turned to Morrison with eyes that held a maturity no 8-year-old should possess and spoke his first complete sentence in English. "They come for me, but they do not come in peace." The cryptic warning sent chills down Morrison's spine. If these were the boy's own people, why would their arrival not bring peace? As if reading the trapper's thoughts, Small Wolf continued, "My father is chief, but my uncle wants his place. He says I must die so his son can lead when father walks the spirit trail." The boy's words painted a picture of tribal politics and family betrayal that Morrison had witnessed among various Indian nations, but never involving a child so young. Morrison found himself caught in an impossible situation. Returning the boy to his people might result in the child's death, but keeping him could spark a war between the Comanche and the white settlements that were slowly spreading across the territory. The trapper had always prided himself on staying neutral in conflicts between different groups, but this situation demanded a choice that would have far-reaching consequences. As the afternoon wore on, the warriors drew closer to Morrison's hidden valley. The trapper could see them more clearly now, and his experienced eye noted details that made his blood run even colder. These were not ordinary Comanche warriors out on a rescue mission. Their faces were painted for war, and they carried an assortment of weapons that included not only traditional bows and lances, but also several military-grade rifles that had obviously been acquired through trade or conquest. The second hook arrived when Small Wolf revealed the true reason for his family's journey so far north of their traditional territory. Speaking in hushed tones as the sound of approaching horses grew louder, the boy explained that his father, Chief Running Bear, had been traveling to meet with representatives of the United States government about a potential peace treaty. The negotiations were being held in secret because many Comanche warriors opposed any agreement with the white settlers who continued to encroach on their ancestral lands. Morrison realized he was now in possession of information that could affect the lives of thousands of people across the frontier. If Chief Running Bear was killed by his own brother during these crucial peace negotiations, it could trigger a war that would devastate both Indian and white communities throughout the territory. The boy's uncle, a war chief named Blood Moon, had apparently discovered the secret meeting and planned to use his nephew's death to justify attacking the peace delegation and seizing control of the tribe. The sound of horses' hooves crunching through snow grew unmistakably close, and Morrison made a decision that went against every survival instinct he had developed during his years on the frontier. Instead of hiding or trying to slip away with the boy, he stepped outside his cabin with his hands raised, presenting himself as a non-threatening figure to the approaching warriors. Small Wolf remained hidden inside, but Morrison could feel the child's frightened eyes watching through a crack in the shutters. The lead warrior was an imposing figure whose face bore the distinctive scars of countless battles. His war paint was more elaborate than the others, indicating his high rank within the war party. When he spoke, his English was surprisingly good, though heavily accented. "White Trapper, you have something that belongs to the Comanche nation. Give us the boy, and you will live to see another sunrise." Morrison's mind raced as he considered his response. He could feel the weight of the child's trust and the potential consequences of his next words. "I found a child near death in the snow," he replied carefully. "I gave him warmth and water, as any man would do for another human being. If you are his people, then you are welcome to him, but I would speak with his father first." The war chief's eyes narrowed dangerously. The boy's father is far from here, and may not live to see his son again. Blood Moon leads this war party, and Blood Moon decides the child's fate. The warrior's words confirmed Small Wolf's earlier revelation about the family conflict, and Morrison realized he was facing a man who would stop at nothing to eliminate threats to his ambition. What happened next defied every expectation Morrison had about Indian warfare tactics. Instead of demanding the immediate surrender of the child, Blood Moon dismounted and approached the cabin with only 2 other warriors, leaving the rest of his force positioned strategically around the valley. The war chief's behavior suggested he was more concerned about witnesses than about quickly recovering his nephew. Blood Moon studied Morrison with calculating eyes that seemed to peer into the trapper's very soul. "You have lived long among the mountains, white man. You understand the ways of survival. The boy carries a sickness that will spread to all who shelter him. It is better that he dies here, where the sickness cannot reach his people." The war chief's words were obviously a lie, but they were delivered with such conviction that Morrison understood he was dealing with a master manipulator. The trapper's response came not from his head, but from his heart. "Every child deserves the chance to grow into a man and choose his own path. If the boy is sick, then I will care for him until he recovers or the Great Spirit calls him home. But I will not hand over a child to those who mean him harm." Morrison's words sealed his fate, but they also revealed the character that had allowed him to survive and thrive in one of the most dangerous environments on Earth. Blood Moon's reaction was swift and brutal. With a gesture to his warriors, he signaled for Morrison to be seized. But the old trapper had not survived 20 years on the frontier by being unprepared for violence. As the two Comanche warriors moved toward him, Morrison drew a concealed knife and backed toward his cabin door, prepared to make his final stand protecting an innocent child. The battle that followed was brief but intense. Morrison managed to wound one of the warriors before being overpowered by sheer numbers. But his resistance bought Small Wolf precious time to escape through a back window and disappear into the dense forest that surrounded the cabin. Blood Moon's rage at the boy's escape was terrible to behold, and Morrison paid the price for his defiance with a beating that left him bloodied but not broken. As Morrison lay semi-conscious on the floor of his cabin, he heard Blood Moon issuing orders to his warriors in rapid Comanche. The war party was splitting up to search for Small Wolf, but the boy had a significant head start and knew these mountains better than Morrison had initially realized. It became clear that the child had been taught survival skills that went far beyond what most 8-year-olds would possess, suggesting that Chief Running Bear had been preparing his son for exactly this type of situation. The mystery deepened when Morrison overheard Blood Moon speaking to one of his lieutenants about a deadline. The peace negotiations were scheduled to conclude in 2 days, and if Chief Running Bear signed the proposed treaty, it would severely limit Blood Moon's ability to wage war against the white settlements. The war chief needed to eliminate both his nephew and his brother before the agreement was finalized, or his dreams of power would be forever beyond reach. Morrison's cabin became the center of a deadly game of cat and mouse as Blood Moon used the injured trapper as bait to lure Small Wolf back. The war chief correctly assumed that the boy would not abandon the man who had risked his life to protect him. Warriors were positioned throughout the forest, waiting for Small Wolf to make a mistake that would reveal his location. But Small Wolf proved to be far more resourceful than anyone had anticipated. Using skills taught to him by his father and other tribal elders, the boy managed to evade capture while staying close enough to monitor the situation at Morrison's cabin. As night fell, Small Wolf began implementing a plan that demonstrated strategic thinking far beyond his years. The first part of the boy's plan involved creating diversions that would draw the warriors away from the cabin. Using techniques learned from watching Comanche hunters, Small Wolf made sounds and left tracks that suggested he was moving toward the main trail that led out of the valley. Several warriors took the bait and departed to set up ambushes along the supposed escape route. With fewer guards around the cabin, Small Wolf was able to get close enough to communicate with Morrison through a series of bird calls that the trapper initially mistook for actual wildlife. The boy had learned these signals from his father's scouts, and Morrison's years of experience in the wilderness helped him recognize that the sounds were not entirely natural. The second part of Small Wolf's plan revealed the true extent of his strategic thinking. Instead of trying to escape the valley entirely, the boy had been using the time to prepare defensive positions and gather intelligence about Blood Moon's forces. Small Wolf had counted every warrior, noted their weapons and positioning, and identified the war chief's weaknesses. What Morrison didn't know was that Small Wolf possessed information that could change the entire dynamic of the situation. Hidden in the boy's clothing was a small leather pouch containing documents related to the peace negotiations. Chief Running Bear had given his son these papers as insurance, knowing that Blood Moon might attempt to interfere with the treaty process. The documents revealed that the United States government had already agreed to most of the Comanche demands, including guaranteed hunting rights on traditional lands and protection from encroachment by white settlers. If Blood Moon succeeded in derailing the negotiations, he would be condemning his own people to continued warfare and eventual destruction. As the second night of the standoff began, Small Wolf made his move. Using darkness as cover, the boy managed to reach the cabin and slip inside through the same back window he had used to escape. Morrison was amazed to see the child return, but Small Wolf's explanation was simple. A warrior does not abandon those who have shown him honor. Working together, Morrison and Small Wolf developed a plan that would expose Blood Moon's treachery to his own warriors. The boy revealed that not all of the war party were loyal to his uncle. Several of the younger warriors had been questioning Blood Moon's leadership, particularly his decision to pursue a child so far from traditional Comanche territory. The plan required Morrison to challenge Blood Moon to single combat, a traditional Comanche method for resolving disputes that the war chief would find difficult to refuse without losing face among his followers. While the two men fought, Small Wolf would present the treaty documents to the other warriors, revealing Blood Moon's true motives for preventing the peace negotiations. The challenge was issued at dawn, with Morrison stepping out of his cabin and calling Blood Moon a coward who would kill children but feared to face a real warrior. The insult struck home, and Blood Moon's pride forced him to accept the challenge despite his overwhelming advantage in numbers and weapons. The fight between Morrison and Blood Moon was brutal and desperate, with both men understanding that only one would survive. The trapper's years of hard living had made him tough as rawhide, but Blood Moon was younger, faster, and fighting for the future leadership of his tribe. As the two men grappled in the snow outside Morrison's cabin, Small Wolf emerged from hiding and began speaking to the assembled warriors in rapid Comanche. The boy's words had an immediate impact on several of the younger warriors, who began questioning their older companions about the true purpose of their mission. When Small Wolf produced the treaty documents and began reading key provisions aloud, the doubt in the warriors' eyes turned to anger as they realized how Blood Moon had deceived them. The turning point came when one of Blood Moon's own lieutenants, a respected warrior named Swift Eagle, stepped forward and demanded an explanation for the war chief's actions. Swift Eagle had been present when Chief Running Bear announced his intention to seek peace with the whites, and he knew that Blood Moon had publicly supported the decision. Blood Moon's response was to break off his fight with Morrison and attack Swift Eagle, but this act of aggression against one of his own men was the final proof the other warriors needed. A chief who would kill his own nephew and murder loyal followers for personal gain was not worthy of leadership. The confrontation that followed split the war party along lines of loyalty and honor. Those warriors who had been uncomfortable with Blood Moon's increasingly erratic behavior sided with Swift Eagle and Small Wolf, while Blood Moon's remaining supporters prepared to fight to the death rather than face disgrace within the tribe. Morrison found himself caught in the middle of a Comanche civil war, but his choice was clear. He stood beside Small Wolf and the warriors who sought to preserve the peace negotiations, knowing that this decision would likely mean his death if Blood Moon's faction emerged victorious. The battle was fierce but brief, with Blood Moon's superior tactics ultimately overcome by the righteous anger of warriors who felt they had been betrayed by their leader. When the fighting ended, Blood Moon lay dead in the snow beside Morrison's cabin, his dreams of power extinguished along with his life. Swift Eagle assumed command of the surviving warriors and faced a difficult decision about what to do with Morrison. The trapper had fought alongside Comanche warriors against their own war chief, creating a situation without precedent in the tribe's history. After consulting with Small Wolf and the other warriors, Swift Eagle declared that Morrison had earned the right to be considered a friend of the Comanche people. The resolution of the immediate crisis still left the larger question of the peace negotiations unresolved. Small Wolf revealed that his father was waiting at Fort Laramie, hundreds of miles to the south, and that Blood Moon's absence from the talks would eventually be noticed and investigated. Morrison made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He volunteered to escort Small Wolf to Fort Laramie, ensuring that the boy would be safely returned to his father and that the peace negotiations could proceed as planned. The journey would be dangerous, particularly with winter storms still raging across the territory, but Morrison felt a responsibility to see the matter through to its conclusion. Swift Eagle agreed to the arrangement, but insisted that two of his most trusted warriors accompany Morrison and Small Wolf on their journey south. The war party would return to Comanche territory and report Blood Moon's death to the tribal council, ensuring that there would be no further challenges to Chief Running Bear's authority. The journey to Fort Laramie took 6 days through some of the most challenging terrain on the frontier. Morrison's cabin was left behind, along with most of his possessions and his old way of life. The trapper found himself fundamentally changed by his encounter with Small Wolf, no longer content to live in isolation from the great events shaping the American West. During the long hours of travel, Small Wolf shared stories of his people and their struggles to maintain their traditional way of life in the face of an expanding American nation. Morrison began to understand that the peace treaty represented more than just an end to hostilities. It was the Comanche people's last hope for survival as a distinct culture. When they finally reached Fort Laramie, Morrison witnessed a reunion between father and son that moved him more deeply than he had expected. Chief Running Bear's joy at seeing Small Wolf alive was matched by his gratitude toward Morrison, and the two men formed a bond that transcended the cultural divide between their peoples. The peace treaty was signed the following day, with Morrison serving as an unofficial witness to the historic agreement. The terms were more favorable to the Comanche than anyone had expected, largely because Chief Running Bear's willingness to risk his son's life for the sake of peace had impressed the American negotiators. Morrison's role in protecting Small Wolf and exposing Blood Moon's treachery became part of Comanche oral tradition, ensuring that his name would be remembered long after he was gone. But for the grizzled trapper, the greatest reward was seeing Small Wolf grow into the kind of leader his people needed for the challenges ahead. Years later, when Small Wolf became Chief Small Wolf and led his people through some of the most difficult periods in Comanche history, he would often speak of the white trapper who had taught him that courage and honor were not defined by the color of a man's skin, but by the choices he made when everything was at stake. Morrison had shown him that sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating enemies, but from finding the strength to do what is right, even when it costs everything you thought you valued. The story of Morrison, Small Wolf, and the winter of 1847 became a legend told around campfires on both sides of the cultural divide, a reminder that understanding and respect between different peoples was possible, even in the midst of the conflicts that would ultimately define the American frontier experience. As the years passed after that fateful winter, the ripple effects of Morrison's choice to save Small Wolf continued to shape the frontier in ways no one could have predicted. The peace treaty signed at Fort Laramie held for nearly a decade, an unprecedented achievement that allowed both Comanche and white settlers to coexist in relative harmony across vast stretches of the Western Territories. Morrison never returned to his cabin in the Montana mountains. Instead, he found himself drawn into a new role as an unofficial mediator between Indian tribes and white settlements throughout the region. His reputation as the man who had risked everything to protect a Comanche child opened doors that had been permanently closed to other white men, and territorial governors began calling upon his services whenever tensions threatened to boil over into violence. The old trapper discovered that his years of solitude had not prepared him for the responsibility of carrying so many lives in his weathered hands. Each successful negotiation saved dozens of families from the horrors of frontier warfare, but each failure haunted him with images of burning homesteads and scalped bodies left scattered across the prairie grass. Morrison aged rapidly during these years, his hair turning completely white and deep lines etching themselves around his eyes as he witnessed the gradual but inexorable destruction of the world he had known. Small Wolf, true to his promise, never forgot the debt he owed to the grizzled mountain man who had defied a Comanche war party to save his life. When the boy came of age at 16, he sought out Morrison and spent an entire summer learning the ways of white society, understanding that his people's survival might someday depend on his ability to navigate both worlds with equal skill. The young Comanche's natural intelligence, combined with his unique perspective on white Indian relations, made him an invaluable ally in Morrison's peacemaking efforts. Together, they prevented 3 separate wars during the 1850s, each time finding creative solutions that addressed the legitimate concerns of both sides without requiring either to abandon their core principles. But the larger forces of American expansion could not be held back forever by the friendship between one white trapper and one Comanche chief's son. The discovery of gold in Colorado brought thousands of prospectors streaming through traditional Comanche hunting grounds, and the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad made it economically feasible for the federal government to maintain large military forces throughout the West. Chief Running Bear died peacefully in 1859, secure in the knowledge that his son was prepared to lead their people through whatever challenges lay ahead. Small Wolf's ascension to leadership of the tribe came at a time when the old agreements were breaking down under pressure from both sides, and even Morrison's influence could not prevent the outbreak of hostilities that would characterize the 1860s. The Civil War changed everything about the American frontier. Federal troops were withdrawn to fight Confederate forces, leaving white settlements vulnerable to Indian attacks, while various tribes saw an opportunity to reclaim lands that had been lost through previous treaties. Morrison found himself caught in the middle of a 3-way conflict between Union forces, Confederate sympathizers, and increasingly militant Indian tribes. During the war years, Morrison and Small Wolf met for the last time at a secret location in the Colorado Rockies. Both men had aged far beyond their years, and both understood that the world they had tried so hard to preserve was disappearing forever. Small Wolf had spent the previous 5 years leading his people in a fighting retreat toward Mexico, while Morrison had watched helplessly as the careful network of agreements he had helped construct collapsed into chaos and bloodshed. Their final conversation lasted 3 days and covered everything from their shared memories of that winter in 1847 to their fears about what the future might hold for their respective peoples. Morrison urged Small Wolf to consider leading his tribe onto one of the reservations being established by the federal government, arguing that it was their only hope for physical survival. Small Wolf listened respectfully but explained that a life confined to a reservation would mean spiritual death for the Comanche, and that he would rather die fighting for their freedom than live as prisoners of the American government. The two men parted knowing they would never see each other again in this life, but their friendship had created something that would outlast both of their deaths. Small Wolf had learned from Morrison that individual acts of courage and compassion could change the course of history, while Morrison had discovered through Small Wolf that true leadership meant being willing to sacrifice everything for principles that transcended personal survival. Morrison died in 1866, killed by a stray bullet during a skirmish between Union cavalry and Confederate raiders near the Kansas border. He was trying to evacuate a mixed community of white and Indian families when the fighting broke out, and his last act was pushing a Cheyenne woman and her children to safety behind an overturned wagon. The bullet that ended his life came from a Confederate rifle, but the soldiers who buried him included both Union and Confederate deserters who had heard stories of his peacemaking efforts. Small Wolf survived until 1874, leading a constantly diminishing band of followers in an increasingly hopeless resistance against the combined forces of the U.S. Army and white settlers hungry for Comanche lands. His death came during the Battle of Palo Duro Canyon, the final defeat that ended Comanche independence forever. Even his enemies acknowledged that he had fought with a courage and dignity that honored both his people and the memory of the white trapper who had saved his life 3 decades earlier. The story of Morrison and Small Wolf became one of those frontier legends that grew in the telling, passed down through generations of settlers, soldiers, and Indians who understood that it represented something precious that had been lost forever. In an era defined by racial hatred and cultural misunderstanding, their friendship demonstrated that it was possible for people from completely different worlds to find common ground based on shared human values. Historians who later studied the period noted that the peace treaty negotiated at Fort Laramie in 1847 represented the last successful attempt at creating a lasting accommodation between Plains Indians and white settlers. The decade of relative peace that followed saved thousands of lives and allowed for a more gradual transition in the American West than might otherwise have occurred. But perhaps the most important legacy of that winter when a trapper found a Comanche boy in the snow was the proof it provided that individual choices matter, even in the face of overwhelming historical forces. Morrison could have walked away from Small Wolf that morning and continued living his solitary life in the mountains. Small Wolf could have chosen hatred over friendship after witnessing his uncle's betrayal and his people's eventual destruction. Instead, both men chose to believe that understanding between different peoples was possible, and their choice created ripples that touched countless lives across the American frontier. In a time when it would have been easy to give in to fear and prejudice, they demonstrated that courage, honor, and compassion were not the exclusive property of any single race or culture, but rather the birthright of all human beings willing to claim them. Their story reminds us that even in the darkest chapters of American history, there were individuals who refused to accept that conflict and hatred were inevitable, and who paid whatever price was necessary to prove that a better world was possible. Morrison and Small Wolf never lived to see their vision fully realized, but their friendship planted seeds of understanding that would eventually bloom in the civil rights movements and cultural reconciliation efforts of later generations. The cabin where it all began still stands in that remote Montana valley, maintained now by the National Park Service as a monument to an unlikely friendship that changed the course of Western history. Visitors who make the difficult journey to reach it often comment on the sense of peace that seems to permeate the location, as if something of Morrison and Small Wolf's spirit still watches over the place where their paths first crossed on that snowy morning so long ago.